That's cool. Before we get started, quick thanks to our sponsors, event organizers, volunteers who've made this amazing event possible. We wouldn't be here without you guys. So as mentioned, a bit about myself. My name is Joel. I'm a product owner at Clicksend, a company based here in Perth, which aims to simplify programmatic messaging for the masses. So think sending things like SMS, MMS, letters via our web app or APIs. So check us out. So if you wanted in here by sheer curiosity, we're going to be talking about shared understanding, how that improves the way your teams operate. But to do so, let's jump all the way back to 1953. Peter Pan's just been released, Elizabeth II's just been coronated as Queen of the Commonwealth, and Sir Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay become the first people to summit Mount Everest. More importantly to us, though, the Cold War had been going on for about 8 years at this point, with America and Russia in an ever-escalating arms race. To better understand what the other side was up to, aerial reconnaissance capability became of the utmost importance. After all, information is power. However, due to the strong anti-air defense of the Russians, any missions flown by the Americans were seen as fairly high risk, as they were consistently intercepted even before they breached the borders. The most notable attempt was in the first half of 1953, with this plane, with a high-altitude variant of this plane, the Martin B-57 Canberra. This was the best option that they had at the time. However, it still had to limp home after nearly being shot down. The largest problem that they had to overcome was Russian radar, with intelligence at the time suggesting it went up to 65,000 feet. So, the American government just put out a request for a plane that could sustain an altitude of 70,000 feet. Initially left out of the original tender, Lockheed Martin, a prominent American aviation manufacturer, caught wind of this in September of 1953. They scrambled and submitted an unsolicited response in March of 1954. And the designs were for this plane, the Lockheed Martin U-2A. The concept was approved, the team assembled in December 1954, and 8 months later, had its first maiden flight in July of 1955. So to put into context how groundbreaking this plane actually was, we've got altitude on the vertical axis. The plane the Americans attempted the missions with, the B-57 Canberra, sits here at about 48,000 feet. The most common Russian interceptor at the time was the MiG-15, operating up to about 50,000 feet. The U-2, however, sits comfortably in its own league, all the way in 70,000 feet. In a mere 8 months, the team managed to build a plane that went higher than everything that came before it. It did so for extended periods of time. Beyond the groundbreaking aviation design, this feat of engineering also required innovations in other aspects, such as new fuel that could operate at those altitudes, as well as partially pressurized flight suits for the pilots. The name of the game here was as high as possible and as far as possible. Every design decision that they took was in service of these two goals, to the point where it was initially rejected because it had strayed that far away from the norm for military spec planes. For instance, they chose to engineer this plane with a lower structural load factor, one more suited for transport planes than combat planes. This allowed them to save on weight otherwise used to strengthen the overall structure and stiffen the plane. Their argument at the time being that you don't need to be that maneuverable at all if they don't even know you're there. Another area of focus for them was the landing gear. They chose to go with one more commonly seen in gliders and sailplanes than jet aircraft. This bicycle-style landing gear, which is effectively two inline wheels, one after the other, is one of the lightest ever assembled, with the whole assembly weighing less than 100 kilograms. However, this also meant that it wouldn't actually bear the weight of the plane falling from more than 2 feet. So think of 2 Subway sandwiches stacked end to end. The next couple of design decisions are going to be a little bit easier to explain with some context. So what you see here is a U-2 coming into land. This is a modern variant. Nothing really much has changed between this and the one built in 1955. So now, you notice that the chase cars appeared. So its primary job is to tell the pilot how far off the ground he is. Remember the 2 feet, right? So he'll shout out things like 3 feet, 2 feet, inches, 1 feet, inches, touchdown. Once it's landed, the pilot puts on the brakes and the plane starts to slow down. From here, pay attention to the level of the wings. More specifically, the one on the right-hand side of the screen. Once it's slowed down sufficiently, it just lets gravity take over and just tips one wing on the ground and drags it right to a stop. And then he just waits there for help. So next up, a bunch of people show up, and what you see them holding onto there are called pogos. They're literally just curved sticks with some wheels on the end. Just so that they have enough clearance to reattach them, the crew literally just manhandles the plane, taking advantage of the lightweight and flexible design resulting from the thin gauge aluminum that they used for the shell. Some of you might have noticed a couple of guys just jumping on the wing. Same goes for this. This dude, once he's done, right, he'll just jump on it and tip it down. So they just do whatever it takes to reinstall the pogos. The guy over there stands underneath it, steps up, just to give this guy a little bit more clearance. In case you guys were wondering what happens on takeoff, it's the exact same process, except in reverse. The plane taxis down the runway, and once it leaves the ground, the pogos just fall off, the plane's off on its way, and the crew comes back to collect them once the runway is clear. Once it's all reinstalled, the plane can finally start taxiing back to the hangar. So what does this have to do with why we're here today? And how does that change the way that we work? What does it even have to do with shared understanding at all? Let's first talk about what it is. I believe it's a core but ethereal part of every single high-performing team, regardless of size. Elusive but almost impossible to put your finger on. It's the electric feeling when everyone's able to power through challenges, sometimes with not much said at all. Everyone's moving to the same beat, and each team member deeply understands the core problems, the purpose, and the trade-offs that exist. It's ultimately an alignment along 3 axes: where the team is going, or in other words, the goal and purpose for the team, how they're getting there, what's the plan, what are the trade-offs and constraints, and lastly, the people on the team. What are their roles? What are the structure they're operating in? And what's the culture and team dynamics underlying the whole thing? The team that built the U2 had a high level of shared understanding. They were able to make the trade-offs bizarre as it seems from the outside, because they all bought into the goal, as high as possible and as far as possible. They knew what they had to do to get there, which was to make the plane as light as possible. They figured out early on that for every half a kilo that they packed into the plane, this cost them about half a meter in altitude. So they got away wherever they could, with human ingenuity and skill. To build that culture of shared understanding, there are 3 essential ingredients: psychological safety, clear and effective communication, and an open, adaptive learning culture. At its peak, the project had about 80 people, with engineers and draftsmen located near the assembly floor so that construction difficulties faced could easily be raised to the appropriate person, a solution found, and implemented. Paperwork was kept to a minimum, to such a point where engineers just made pencil notations directly on the original engineering drawings. Creating that sense of shared understanding is not just about writing up documentation and then putting the onus on the person listening or reading. But don't get me wrong. This doesn't mean no documentation, but that we supplement our verbal and written with other factors such as visual or tactile, where required, but not to the point where it becomes a burden. Just because something's written down does not mean you've effectively communicated anything at all. There's no way we're going to be able to capture every single requirement down to the last detail. As long as we understand who we're building things for and why it matters to them, some of it can really just be covered with a sense of shared understanding. Next, psychological safety. It's the belief that no one will be punished for speaking out with ideas, concerns, or mistakes. The team operates in a high-trust environment. The team operates in a high-trust environment, and the team members feel more engaged, empowered, knowing that the concerns and considerations matter. It allows them to learn from their mistakes and can focus on preventing it from happening again. We're all going to make mistakes anyways. We might as well just learn from them. However, note that this is not the acceptance of mediocrity, but the belief that everyone's here to do great work. Failure to do so stems from systemic or process issues. There's no magic bullet for this. It can only be fostered over time, as the team faces different challenges along the way, but take the opportunities where they arise. Simple things of doing this can be things like meaningful and productive retrospectives, blameless postmortems, or simply just keeping your emotions in check, making sure that you do not overreact when receiving negative news. Lastly, an open, adaptive, and learning culture. This can mean very different things to different teams and organizations. For some, it can be as simple as being clear about the hard constraints that we're working under, whether that's timeline, resources, scope, and why they even exist at all. For others, it might just mean going beyond greenwashing your projects and truly representing projects as at risk. Some simple steps to foster this are early and frequent showcases. There's no worse feeling than starting a project with what you thought was everyone on the same page, only to find out months later that you're on completely separate trajectories. However, this also means being comfortable with people critiquing your work that's in progress. It may not be representative of the level of polish that you as an individual can achieve. As the person doing the showcase, it could be helpful to propose things like areas of, in particular areas that you're looking for feedback on. And as the attendee, try to focus your feedback so that it's relevant to the current phase. Focusing on things like specific shades of the button and how it's not quite right, not particularly the most useful at the very beginning of the project when you're still deciding on the overall interaction model. So for those of us fortunate to have found ourselves in a team with a high level of shared understanding, some of you may have noticed that it gets harder to maintain over time. Once the business starts growing, things that were simple became much more complicated and complex. That's where Metcalfe's law comes in, with the simple notion that communication channels get exponentially more difficult the more people that you have in the team. How the team or organization communicated previously may have to drastically change in order to maintain the same fidelity of communication across the business. Shared understanding needs to be fostered at every single level of the organization. Each team first needs to ensure that everyone's pulling in the same direction, and then that it's congruent with the other teams in the business and is in service of the greater goal. But that being said, how does that apply to each and every single one of us? For those of us in positions of influence, the charge is clear, which is to communicate and get our teams to carry the torch. What about for us individual contributors? I'd argue that we have an equally important part to play, which is to challenge and push with the diverse perspectives that we bring to the table. This might take the form of things like one-on-ones to clarify the underlying strategy and understand the different factors involved in making certain decisions, or just a grander vision that had not yet been communicated. But once we're on board, help to champion the cause and pull others along the journey as well. So I'll leave you with my favorite example of shared understanding gone slightly awry. So many years ago, I was tutoring a bunch of 3 to 5-year-olds and we were working through some math questions. First question was fairly simple. In the cells of a circle, write the correct number in the sequence. Kid goes off, comes back fairly quickly with the correct answer. Next question was a little bit harder, right? The goal was still the same. In the cells of a circle, write the correct number in the sequence. This time, though, there's a couple of blank spots. As adults, we look at this and we understand that this is to test the kids' abstract thinking and if they're able to count without all the information being there. However, when she came with the answers, she had written just every single box had a number in them. I pointed out what was wrong with it, which was just the circles should have numbers in them, but she gave me one of those slow, distant nods, the ones that don't really give you a lot of confidence, but she still ran off to get it fixed. What she came back with, though, was every cell had a circle, technically. She had technically adhered to the written requirement, but completely missed the bigger picture. She just didn't understand the goal or purpose of the exercise at all. So to recap, focus on building a sense of shared understanding with your teams. Before they began manufacturing the first U2, Kelly Johnson, the chief engineer of the project, put together set clear goals for the team, with things like max altitude, cruising speed, max payload, and a test flight date. The team then used the initial designs for the plane and managed trade-offs as they went along. Lastly, they brought together different teams and set the culture and structure in which they operated. To improve on that, focus on building upon the 3 pillars of psychological safety: communication and the underlying culture. So with that, thanks for coming along to my session, and hope this helps you change the way that you and your team operate. Thank you.